It was just another ordinary day at the airport, bustling with people moving from one terminal to another, rushing to catch flights or waiting for their bags. Amidst all the activity, one woman stood out, not because of her clothes or her demeanor, but because of the quiet confidence that radiated from her. She moved with a sense of purpose, her every step calculated as though she had walked this path countless times before. She wasn't just any passenger. She was someone important, someone with a heavy title attached to her name, the director of the FBI. In her plain professional attire, no one would have guessed she held such a high position. But she didn't need anyone to know. To her, it wasn't about the title. It was about the responsibility. The people she served, the work she did, the laws she upheld. As she walked through the security check, the usual process was smooth. A polite nod to the agents behind the counter, a brief exchange as they checked her credentials, and soon enough she was free to go. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Just another step in what should have been a simple journey. But that was about to change. What should have been a quiet trip turned into an ordeal that would go down in history. The woman had no way of knowing it then. But her life was about to intersect with an encounter that would challenge her every belief in the system she served so faithfully. It wasn't the kind of experience she ever expected to have, especially not in a public place, surrounded by so many people. It happened quickly. One moment she was walking toward her gate, trying to catch a few quiet moments before her flight. The next moment she felt the tap on her shoulder. A voice called out from behind her, firm and demanding. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can you please come with us?" She turned, her heart not racing but her instincts kicking in. It was a routine interaction at first glance. There was nothing to suggest anything was wrong. But then she noticed something odd. The uniforms didn't belong to airport security. These were local police officers, not just any officers, but a few whose names she'd heard of before. They were known for their hardline approach to law enforcement, officers who often took things too far. Their reputation preceded them. Without hesitation, she identified herself, showing them her badge and explaining her position. "I'm the director of the FBI. I'm traveling for official business." The words should have been enough. After all, in any other circumstance, the badge of the FBI director would have opened doors. It should have been the kind of authority that immediately ended any misunderstanding. But these officers weren't impressed. In fact, they didn't even look at her badge. They simply stared at her, their eyes filled with a mix of skepticism and something more dangerous. Bias. "We'll need to take you in for questioning," one of the officers said, his voice sharp and unwavering. She froze for a moment, taken aback. She knew the system, knew the rules. This wasn't supposed to happen. "I'm not going anywhere. I've done nothing wrong," she replied, her voice steady but with an edge of confusion creeping in. But the officers didn't back down. They weren't listening. They had already made up their minds. Their actions were becoming more aggressive by the second. The director, well versed in the art of de-escalation, kept her composure, but she could feel her frustration mounting. It was absurd. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The officers, oblivious to who they were dealing with, started to push her toward a holding area. She couldn't believe it. A woman of her stature, one who had spent years serving the country and enforcing the law, was being treated like a common criminal. The feeling was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. And yet, there she was, powerless in the face of blatant disrespect and ignorance. She tried again. "You don't understand. I'm not a threat. I'm an FBI director." But the officers weren't interested in hearing her out. The more she tried to explain, the more they tightened their grip. It wasn't about listening to reason. It was about power. They were making a point, and they didn't care who they hurt in the process. The airport, usually filled with the hum of travelers, seemed to grow quieter around them. People began to stop and stare. Some pulled out their phones to record. Others whispered to each other, unsure of what was happening. The director could feel their eyes on her, but she focused on the officers. She couldn't afford to get distracted. The longer she remained calm, the quicker this would end. Or so she hoped. The tension was palpable. She could hear the officers muttering among themselves, but their words were incomprehensible over the noise of the crowd. The situation was deteriorating fast. She could feel the eyes of bystanders on her, some confused, some judgmental. She knew it wasn't just about her anymore. If this went wrong, it could make headlines. This was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Finally, one of the officers stepped forward and attempted to explain. "We're just following orders, ma'am. There's been a security concern." The excuse felt hollow. The director's gut told her that something more was going on here, something beyond a simple security check. She stood her ground, her face unwavering, as she replied, "I have nothing to hide. You know who I am. I've worked my entire career to uphold the law. You have no reason to arrest me." But the words fell on deaf ears. The officers, instead of offering any explanation, continued to force her forward. They were now dragging her along, ignoring her protests, ignoring everything she said. The director's mind raced. What was happening? How had things gone so wrong? As she was being led away, the crowd around her began to react. A few people were vocal, questioning the officer's actions, but most simply watched, unsure of how to intervene. Some even whispered among themselves, pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding scene. They knew something wasn't right. In the midst of the chaos, the director's mind was already working. She was thinking ahead, analyzing the situation. The officer's behavior wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. They didn't care about who she was, and they certainly didn't care about the laws they were sworn to uphold. She wasn't just a woman being arrested. She was a symbol of authority, a figurehead for the system. The moment she was detained, the system itself had been called into question. How far would this go? What would happen next? It was impossible to tell. The only thing she could do was stay calm and hope that someone, somewhere, would notice what was happening. But in the back of her mind, the question lingered. How had she, someone so deeply entrenched in the world of law and order, ended up in this mess? What had gone wrong? As she was led toward the holding area, her mind raced faster than her feet. This wasn't over, not yet, but it was only just beginning. As the director was led through the busy terminal, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She couldn't understand what was happening. She had spent her entire career upholding the law, making sure that justice was served, and now here she was, in the middle of an airport, being dragged by two officers with no real explanation. The chaos around her only made things worse. People were staring, whispering, some even recording, but no one stepped forward to help. She didn't expect anyone to. This wasn't their fight. But still, the feeling of being publicly humiliated stung. She had seen law enforcement fail before, but never in such a blatant way. The officers continued to march her down a long hallway, passing by other travelers who looked at the scene with confusion. She could hear their murmurs, some trying to piece together what was going on. "Who is she?" one of them asked, while another whispered, "She doesn't look like a criminal." The director wanted to shout back, to explain herself, but she knew that wouldn't help. It would only make things worse. She focused on keeping calm. The last thing she needed was to let her emotions get the better of her. She couldn't afford to show fear, even though inside her mind was racing. What was their game? Why had they targeted her? She thought about her colleagues back at the FBI. They would be working furiously to figure out what had gone wrong. Someone, somewhere, would be picking up the phone to get this sorted out. It was only a matter of time before someone realized the mistake. But time in that moment felt slow. Every step she took seemed to echo in her ears, and with each step, the distance between her and the outside world grew. The officers were still silent, their hands firmly gripping her arms. She was being treated like a criminal, as though she had done something unforgivable. The thought was maddening. But she had learned long ago to never let anger cloud her judgment. Instead, she did what she did best, she observed. She watched the officers closely. One of them was young, still fresh in his career, while the other seemed more seasoned, more confident in his actions. The younger officer was fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while the older officer seemed completely unfazed, as if arresting a government official was just another day on the job. The older officer was the one leading her through the maze of hallways, his grip never loosening. He barely acknowledged her as they walked, his focus solely on the task at hand. But the younger officer kept glancing over at her, his eyes filled with doubt. Was he second-guessing their actions? Did he realize deep down that something was terribly wrong? Or was he just following orders as they had always been taught to do? Finally, they arrived at a small room, a holding area where she would be detained temporarily. It wasn't much, just a small space, with a metal bench against the wall and a bright overhead light that made the whole room feel sterile and cold. The officers shoved her into the room, their hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. Once inside, the door was slammed shut behind her. She was alone. For a brief moment, the director allowed herself to breathe. The room was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she could hear her own thoughts. She took a moment to collect herself. There was no use panicking. She needed to stay calm and focus on what came next. The first step was making sure her colleagues knew what had happened. She pulled out her phone and quickly texted the one person she trusted most within the FBI. Been detained. At airport. We'll explain later. Handle this. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The message would get the ball rolling. Now all she had to do was wait. As the minutes ticked by, she kept thinking about how she got here. What had happened? She had traveled countless times for work, always with the utmost professionalism. So why this time? Why was she being treated like this? Was it just a random mistake? Or was there something more sinister at play? Her mind went back to the officers she had encountered. The older one, with his dismissive attitude, had seemed intent on making her feel small. The younger officer, however, hadn't looked so sure of himself. She wondered if he had been forced into this situation, maybe even against his own will. If that was the case, she'd be sure to let him off the hook when this was all over. He had a career ahead of him, and she wasn't one to destroy a person over a single mistake. But the older officer? She couldn't say the same for him. The level of arrogance and disregard for authority was inexcusable. Minutes turned to hours, and still, no one came to explain what was going on. She wasn't sure if the officers had gone for backup or if they were waiting for something. The fact that she hadn't heard from her colleagues yet was troubling. Maybe they hadn't gotten the message. Maybe they hadn't realized she was in danger. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about a mistake. It was something more. The way they had treated her, it was as if they had decided, before even asking a single question, that she was guilty. She thought about how many times she had seen that kind of behavior. It wasn't just incompetence. It was prejudice, plain and simple. They had judged her before they even knew who she was. The longer she stayed in that holding room, the more she realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about her. This was about everything she had worked for. About the trust people had placed in her. If the public found out about this, if the world saw what had happened, it would raise questions about the integrity of law enforcement. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. As time passed, the weight of the situation settled in. She knew that this wasn't just a bad encounter. It was a sign of something broken in the system, something that needed to change. Just when she began to feel the full weight of isolation, the door to the holding room opened. 2 more officers stepped inside. This time they weren't wearing uniforms. They were plainclothes. The director stood up immediately, her posture straightening. These weren't the officers who had arrested her. They were higher up the chain. She could tell by the way they carried themselves, by the way the first one immediately began speaking. "We're here to help," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've been made aware of what happened. I apologize for the delay." The apology felt hollow, but she kept her emotions in check. "What's going on? Why was I detained?" she asked, her voice steady, demanding answers. The 2 officers exchanged a brief look before one of them spoke again. "There seems to have been a mix-up, a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" The director couldn't believe her ears. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" The officer didn't respond right away, but his face revealed the realization. She had a feeling this was going to be far bigger than just a mix-up. As the seconds turned into minutes, the director stood silently, waiting for the officers to explain themselves. The room felt cold, the silence stretching out, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She couldn't quite make sense of everything. How had things spiraled so quickly? Her experience had taught her how to handle tense situations, but nothing in her training had prepared her for this. The idea that she, of all people, could be wrongfully detained in an airport felt almost unreal. The officer who had apologized earlier shifted uncomfortably. His partner, who had yet to speak, was scanning through a set of papers on a clipboard, his eyes darting back and forth as if trying to find something. The tension in the room grew with each passing moment. The director knew this wasn't just a simple mistake. There was something more beneath the surface, something that they weren't telling her. "What do you mean by misunderstanding?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, betraying none of the frustration that had been building inside her. The first officer cleared his throat, as if he was preparing to offer an explanation, but hesitated. The other officer finally looked up, his face tight, and met her gaze for the first time since entering. The longer he remained silent, the more it became clear that this was not the kind of error that could be easily explained away. The situation, the second officer began slowly, was escalated due to a miscommunication between our team and the security personnel. You were unintentionally detained in error. In error? The director repeated, her brow furrowing. I don't buy it. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know when a mistake is more than just a mistake. The officer shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He knew the truth, and yet there was something that kept him from speaking plainly. Look, he continued, his voice dropping a little lower. This is complicated. We've been informed that you were identified as someone else. The director's expression shifted as she processed his words. Someone else? She repeated. Are you saying that you thought I was a criminal? You thought I was a suspect? The disbelief was evident in her tone now. She had been in law enforcement too long to be fooled by vague explanations. The first officer spoke up again, clearly uneasy. It wasn't that. We didn't know who you were when we first approached. It was just protocol. He seemed to be scrambling for the right words. Protocol? The director's voice was tight now, a sense of coldness creeping into her tone. You arrest someone based on protocol without even checking their identity? Without verifying who they are? She could see the officers squirming, their uncomfortable body language telling her everything she needed to know. These weren't seasoned law enforcement officers who were fully capable of handling a situation like this. They were just two men, relying too heavily on the power they had been given and not enough on their judgment. They had treated her like an unknown figure rather than someone who was far more important than they could ever understand. We've made a mistake, the second officer said finally, his words coming out more like an apology than an explanation. The director's anger flared briefly, but she held it back, not wanting to show how deeply this mistake had cut her. She knew this wasn't just a lapse in judgment. This was something else, a failure of the system that she had worked so hard to uphold. It was about prejudice, about assumptions made based on appearance, about systemic flaws that ran far deeper than any individual officer's actions. What happens now? She asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. What are you going to do about it? The first officer hesitated again, exchanging a glance with his partner before answering. We'll release you, of course. You're free to go once we confirm your identity. Confirm my identity? She repeated, incredulous. You have my badge, my name, my credentials. What more is there to confirm? The second officer cleared his throat again, obviously uncomfortable with the situation he was in. I understand this is frustrating, he said softly. We'll make sure this never happens again. The director looked at both men for a long moment, trying to read the situation. She wasn't sure if they were truly sorry or just trying to get out of a bad situation. Either way, it didn't matter now. What mattered was how she responded. You understand this is bigger than just an apology, right? She said quietly but firmly. This isn't just about me. It's about the trust people place in law enforcement. It's about the system and the faith that people have that the law will protect them. When you make a mistake like this, it shakes that faith. It shakes everything. There was a pause as the weight of her words hung in the air. The two officers didn't respond, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint buzz of the overhead lights. The director knew they weren't the only ones at fault here. She understood that this was a larger issue, a systemic one. The prejudice she had witnessed from the officers was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem that plagued law enforcement. The bias, the assumptions, the lack of proper training in handling sensitive situations. She had seen it all before, but never in such a personal way. Do you think this is just a one-time error? She asked, her voice soft but piercing. That this is just about two officers who made a mistake? You've seen this kind of thing happen before. It happens every day to people who don't have the resources, the connections, the protection that I do. The officers remained silent, their eyes avoiding hers. She knew they were hearing her words, but whether they understood the gravity of the situation was another question entirely. The silence between them was broken by a sudden knock at the door. The director turned her head toward the sound, and before she could respond, the door swung open. Two more officers entered, both in full uniform. The air seemed to change with their arrival, thick with authority and something else, something the director couldn't quite place. "We've been informed of the situation," one of the new officers said, his voice calm and controlled. "We need to resolve this as quickly as possible." The first two officers stepped back, allowing the new arrivals to take charge of the situation. The director's gaze shifted between the two new officers and the ones who had detained her. She knew what was coming next. The real investigation into what had happened was about to begin. The questions that had been ignored would finally be asked. "You're free to go," the new officer continued, nodding toward her. "We apologize for the confusion and we will be conducting a full review of this incident." The director didn't move immediately. Instead, she stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. It wasn't over yet. This wasn't just about her. It was about the bigger issue. There were going to be consequences, and they weren't just for the officers involved in the incident. The entire system was going to have to change. "I'm leaving," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." The officers, now silent, watched as she turned to leave the room. But the words she had spoken lingered in the air. The real work was just beginning. As the director stepped out of the holding room, the weight of the situation still lingered in her mind. The air in the hallway felt thick with tension, and the noise of the bustling airport seemed like a distant hum compared to the internal chaos she was feeling. She wasn't free just yet, no matter what the officers had said. She knew there was still a long road ahead to truly clear her name. What had happened to her wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of something larger, something that needed to be addressed. As she walked down the hallway, she tried to steady her thoughts. This was no longer about the officers who had detained her. They were only a small part of the problem. The bigger issue was systemic, the deep-rooted biases and assumptions that plagued law enforcement across the country. This was something she had dealt with for years in her role as FBI director, but now it was personal. It was real, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out quickly, recognizing the number of her assistant back at the FBI. "Director, we've been trying to reach you. We've heard about what happened. Are you all right?" The voice on the other end was full of concern, but she could hear the undertones of frustration and urgency. The director let out a sigh, running a hand through her hair. "I'm fine, but we have a bigger issue here than me. I'll explain when I get back to the office. I need a full investigation into this now." "Understood," the assistant replied. "We're already mobilizing a team. We'll have the details ready for you when you return." The director could hear the sound of typing in the background. Her team was already at work. She felt a brief sense of relief. At least she wasn't alone in this. But that didn't change the fact that what had happened to her was a clear failure of the system. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about years of unchecked bias, about how too often people were judged not by their actions but by their appearance, their race, or their position in society. This wasn't just something she could let slide. By the time she reached the exit of the airport, the scene had calmed down a bit. The crowds had dispersed, and the chaos from earlier was beginning to settle into a low murmur. She had expected more questions from bystanders or reporters, but it seemed that people had already lost interest. The story would likely fade from the news cycle quickly, but she knew that for her this moment wasn't going to fade, not until she made sure something changed. The moment she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, a gust of wind greeted her, but it felt almost foreign. She had been so deep in her thoughts, so focused on everything that had just happened, that she hadn't noticed how long she'd been trapped in that sterile holding room. She wanted to go home, to take a moment to breathe and recover, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. She had to make sure that this didn't just end here. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a colleague in law enforcement. "We're gathering the footage from the security cameras now. We've seen it. The officer's actions were completely unjustified. We're compiling a full report. Stand by." She stared at the message for a few moments, letting it sink in. The footage. The proof. This was what she needed. Now it was about holding people accountable. As she slid into the back of a car, her assistant called again. "Director, we've been in touch with the airport authorities. They've confirmed the officers have been removed from their positions for the time being. An internal investigation is underway." "That's a start," she replied, leaning back in the seat. "But this goes beyond a couple of bad officers. This is about the way our system operates, how we treat people, how we judge people before we even know who they are." "I agree. the assistant said, their voice steady. We'll handle this. I'll keep you updated with the investigation. You focus on what's next. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I'll handle what's next, she murmured. But this is just the beginning. We need to fix the system, not just the individuals. Back at the office, the director didn't waste any time. She gathered her closest team members, everyone who could help dig into the issue. She knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix. The investigation into the officer's conduct would be just one part of the puzzle. The larger question was how to prevent this from happening again, how to address the broader problem of bias in law enforcement. She sat down at the head of the conference table, her team surrounding her. The room was filled with a mixture of urgency and anticipation. She could see that everyone understood the gravity of what had happened. The question now was where to begin. We need to start with a full review of the officers involved, she said, her voice steady. We need to understand their actions, their motivations. We need to know if this was an isolated incident, or if this behavior is more widespread. One of her senior officers nodded. We're already gathering reports from the airport and any nearby surveillance footage. We'll know what happened in detail soon. That's good. But it doesn't stop there. We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We need to look at the training protocols, the policies that allowed something like this to unfold. Another officer spoke up. We'll review the policies, Director. We'll dig into the department's history, its relationships with other agencies. We'll look at everything. The director leaned forward, her gaze hardening. This isn't just about one department or one incident. This is about a system that has failed people. This is about a problem that goes far beyond individual officers. We need to address the root causes. The room went quiet. Everyone in the room understood exactly what she was saying. She wasn't talking about just the two officers involved. She was talking about a culture of bias, about a system that had become too comfortable with its assumptions, too blind to the way it treated people who didn't fit the mold of what was deemed acceptable. The director's voice softened, but her resolve was clear. We need to make sure that no one is treated the way I was today. No one should ever feel powerless, judged before they even open their mouth. We need to fix this, not just for me, but for everyone. Her words hung in the air. The team was silent, but their expressions were filled with determination. This was their mission now. They weren't just investigating an isolated incident. They were setting a new course for the future. A future where no one was ever unjustly treated because of their position, their race, or their background. That evening, as the director sat alone in her office, she took a moment to reflect. The weight of the day had left her exhausted, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not yet, there was still so much work to do. But she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of something bigger. It was a turning point, a chance to make real, lasting change. She looked out the window, her thoughts drifting to the future. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for the challenge. She had faced adversity before, but this was different. This time it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about changing it. And that, more than anything, was what she had dedicated her life to. The following days after the incident at the airport were a blur. The director had never been one to shy away from tough situations, but this was different. She felt the weight of it all, the responsibility, the eyes of the public, and the consequences of this moment reaching far beyond herself. The world was watching now, and for the first time in her career, the spotlight wasn't on the work she had done for years, but on the failure of the system she had dedicated herself to. It wasn't just the officers involved that needed to be held accountable. This was a chance to rewrite the rules, to correct an injustice that had been quietly embedded in law enforcement for far too long. She was determined not to let this moment pass. If it was going to be a turning point, then it would need to be a permanent one. Back at the FBI headquarters, the director's office was filled with the sounds of hurried conversations and tapping keyboards. Her team worked tirelessly, reviewing every piece of evidence they could find. The airport footage had been handed over, and the recordings clearly showed the confusion and miscommunication that had led to her wrongful detention. But even that wasn't enough. The deeper issues, the biases, the systemic flaws, those were the things that needed to be addressed. As she sat in her office, surrounded by files and reports, the director was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was her assistant. Director, we've compiled everything. The internal investigation into the officers is complete. We're ready to release the findings to the public. The director's eyes narrowed slightly and she set down the pen she had been holding. She knew this moment was coming. The question was how much of the truth to reveal, how much of the story needed to be told. She had always believed in transparency, but this was more complicated. There was a delicate balance between revealing the full extent of the issue and ensuring the right steps were taken to make real change. "Let's review it," she said, motioning for her assistant to come in and sit down. Together, they went over the findings of the investigation. It was clear that the officers had acted without proper procedure, but it was also clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just a matter of one bad decision, it was part of a larger pattern. The report highlighted instances where similar mistakes had been made, cases where individuals had been unfairly profiled or wrongfully detained. The director's gut had been right. This wasn't just a fluke. It was systemic. As they finished reading, the director leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with the implications. This wasn't just about two officers making a mistake. This was about the culture that allowed such actions to happen. It was about how, too often, law enforcement had failed to see the humanity in the people they were supposed to protect. "We can't just release this report and move on," she said finally, her voice firm. "We need to do something more. We need to take action. We need to fix the system, not just punish the individuals involved." Her assistant nodded. "We'll make the recommendations clear. We'll emphasize the need for reform." The director stood up and walked over to the window, her gaze distant as she thought about the long road ahead. There was a lot of work to be done and it wouldn't be easy, but she knew this was her chance to make a real difference, to make sure that no one else would have to go through what she had. She wouldn't let this go unnoticed. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The director worked closely with her team, drafting new policies, revising training protocols, and speaking with law enforcement leaders from around the country. She knew that real change wouldn't come overnight, but it had to start somewhere. She was determined to make sure that this wasn't just another news cycle, another headline that faded away. She called for a national summit on law enforcement reform, bringing together experts, community leaders, and activists to discuss the changes that were needed. The summit was a tense but necessary conversation. The director knew that there would be pushback, that many in law enforcement would resist change. But she was prepared. She had lived through enough battles in her career to know that progress often came with struggle. As the summit began, the director took to the stage. The room fell silent as she walked up to the podium, her mind sharp, her purpose clear. She had a message to deliver, not just to law enforcement, but to the nation. "I stand before you today not just as the director of the FBI, but as someone who believes in justice," she began, her voice steady and strong. "Justice isn't just about the laws we create. It's about the way we enforce those laws. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like, is treated with dignity and respect." What happened to me at that airport was a symptom of a much larger problem. It wasn't about two officers making a mistake. It was about a system that failed to see me as a human being. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent. She could see the tension in the faces of some of the law enforcement officials in the audience. But she knew this conversation needed to happen. This isn't just about accountability for the individuals involved. It's about accountability for the system. It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to change the way we operate, to examine the biases that have been built into our policies, and to ensure that we are working toward a system that truly serves the people. Her words were met with a mixture of silence and quiet nods. The director knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. Change had to start somewhere, and she was going to make sure it started now. After the summit, there was a noticeable shift. The conversation began to spread, not just in law enforcement circles, but throughout the country. People were talking about the issues that had been raised, the reforms that were being discussed. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like things were moving in the right direction. The director spent the following months working tirelessly to ensure that the reforms were put into place. It wasn't easy. There were countless meetings, debates, and setbacks, but slowly the wheels of change began to turn. New training programs were introduced for officers, focusing on bias reduction and cultural sensitivity. Police departments around the country began to adopt new policies aimed at ensuring more transparency and accountability in their actions. But for the director, the work didn't stop there. She knew that the road to real reform was long and complicated. She had fought for justice her entire life, and this was just one chapter in a much larger story. The change that was needed wasn't going to be quick or easy. It would take time, effort, and determination from all sides. But she was ready for it. She had faced adversity before. This time it wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that future generations would have a fairer, more just system to rely on. As the months passed, the director looked back on the events that had set everything in motion. The airport incident, painful as it had been the catalyst for something much larger. It had forced a conversation that needed to happen. It had revealed flaws in a system that had long been hidden from the public eye, and it had sparked a movement for change that was just beginning. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she was determined to see it through. Because in the end, it wasn't just about making things right for herself. It was about making things right for everyone. Months passed, and the director found herself at the forefront of a movement she never anticipated, but had come to embrace with a fierce resolve. The reforms she had pushed for were slowly taking root, but there was still so much work to be done. It wasn't enough to simply address the immediate issues that had arisen from her wrongful detention. It was about creating a foundation for long-term change. The conversations, the pushback, the growing awareness, it was a process. But the momentum was undeniable. She had spent years in law enforcement, never imagining that an incident so personal could lead to a nationwide conversation about the flaws in the system. Yet here she was, a central figure in a wave of change. But even as she fought for justice, there were moments of doubt. She couldn't help but wonder if the changes she was championing would truly be enough. At the same time, her faith in the work she was doing was unwavering. The calls for reform were gaining traction, both within law enforcement and in the public sphere. The more people spoke up about the need for change, the more she felt the weight of the responsibility to ensure those voices were heard. It was overwhelming at times, but it also brought with it a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. This wasn't just about one individual. This was about a system that impacted millions of lives. And she was determined to be part of the solution. One day, as she sat in her office reviewing a stack of documents, her assistant walked in with a stack of reports. "Director, here are the latest findings from the field offices. They've been implementing the new training protocols and policies we discussed." The director glanced at the papers but didn't immediately respond. Her mind was elsewhere, on the faces of the people she had met during the summit, on the countless individuals who had shared their stories of bias and mistreatment. It was those voices more than anything that drove her forward. "Anything significant?" she finally asked, looking up from her desk. Her assistant nodded, flipping through the papers quickly. "The feedback is mixed. Some departments have made considerable progress, but others are resisting the changes. There's still a lot of work to be done, but overall things are moving in the right direction." The director leaned back in her chair, considering the information. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But she had always believed that meaningful transformation came from persistence. She couldn't expect to fix everything overnight, but every step forward was a victory. "We can't afford to let up now," she said, her voice firm. "We need to keep pushing. We need to hold those departments accountable. Every officer, every agency needs to understand that these reforms aren't optional." Her assistant nodded, scribbling notes. "Understood. We're already planning the next phase of implementation." "Good," she said, her thoughts shifting. "We'll need to keep the pressure on. Public awareness is key. We can't just pass policies and expect them to stick. We need the public to see that these changes are necessary, that they are a response to the deep-rooted issues that have plagued law enforcement for years." The assistant hesitated before responding. "Director, there's something else. We've received word that some of the officers involved in your detainment have been reassigned. The public has caught wind of it, and there's already talk in the media." The director's brow furrowed. She had been expecting backlash, but this was different. It wasn't just about her now. It was about the larger implications of the reforms. "What exactly are they saying?" Her assistant paused before answering. "There's criticism. Some say that the officers are being made scapegoats, that the real problem is deeper than just a few bad apples. Others are questioning whether the reforms go far enough. There's a lot of noise right now." The director stood up, her expression thoughtful. Let them talk. The truth is, this isn't about any one officer. This is about a system that has failed the people it was supposed to protect. If they want to focus on individuals, that's their choice. But we're focused on the bigger picture. As she walked to the window, her thoughts turned to the journey she had taken to get here. The early days of her career had been focused on personal achievement, climbing the ranks, proving herself in a field that had always been dominated by men. But what she was fighting for now was different. It wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't even about law enforcement. It was about the people who had been mistreated, forgotten and ignored for far too long. It was about ensuring that the law served everyone equally. The battle wasn't over. It wouldn't be until every person, regardless of their background, was treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. That was the real goal. The systemic issues would take years to address, but each small victory mattered. And they were winning. Over the next few weeks, the director worked tirelessly to strengthen the reforms. She held more meetings with law enforcement leaders, public officials, and activists. They discussed what had been achieved so far and what still needed to be done. The changes were beginning to take hold, but resistance remained strong, especially from those who felt threatened by the shift in power dynamics. But she wasn't about to back down. She had seen the effects of unchecked power, the damage it could do to individuals and communities. She had experienced it firsthand, and now she was determined to ensure that no one else would have to face what she had faced. One afternoon, she received a call from a familiar voice. It was her old mentor, someone she had worked closely with in her early days at the FBI. The director's heart skipped a beat as she picked up the phone. "How are you holding up?" her mentor asked, a tone of concern in his voice. "I'm making progress," she replied, her voice steady. "But there's still a lot of work to be done." "You've always been determined," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Just don't forget that change takes time. Keep pushing, but don't expect it all to happen overnight. You're doing important work. Just make sure you're taking care of yourself too." The director smiled softly. "I appreciate that. But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about everyone who's been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. And I'm not stopping until things change." Her mentor's voice softened. "I know. Just remember, real change takes patience. But it's worth it in the end." As the months continued to pass, the director felt the weight of her responsibility grow heavier. The changes were starting to take root, but she knew that this battle was far from over. The road to reform was long and difficult, but the progress was undeniable. She was making a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that had failed them. And through it all, one thing remained certain in her heart. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the future. A future where every person, regardless of who they were, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. And no matter what it took, she was going to see it through.